Wow, there's a lot of people out here. There was a cavern earlier. Almost looked like an Obama re-election meeting. But you guys are a lot happier. So, hi, welcome. My name's Mike, like Matt said, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a subject that does not get discussed very often, if ever, and it's the ancient practice of what's called a letter of marque and reprisal. A letter of marque is issued, but we don't call it a letter of marque. For example, and I'm just going off the top of my head now, not prepared yet. For example, when they put a bounty out on Osama bin Laden's head, that's a letter of marque. It was successfully executed by SEAL Team 6, but a private individual could have captured bin Laden and could have claimed that $10 million reward. There's a reward out currently for these lunatics that we call ISIS. And ISIL, ISIS, ISIL, Hydra, SHIELD, I lose track of all these acronyms. If that reward is cashed in, the nitwits in Congress don't realize that they've actually issued a letter of marque. That's what it is. If you're a marked man, you've got a bounty on your head. This is one way that we can deal with counterterrorism as libertarians and conservatives and not invade other countries and spend the next 100 years fulfilling John McCain's fantasies. So we have to be a little more familiar with the process, so I'm going to try to do that today. First off, start off with a little fun stuff here. On Wednesday, I don't know if you saw, Michelle Obama went to St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, and she was generally well received, but there were a couple of kids that ran for the exits because they thought she was serving lunch. Speaking of Michelle Obama, how about President Obama? President Obama said ISIS must be destroyed. We've got to destroy them. We've got to destroy ISIS. But then he said, well, maybe it could be a manageable problem. When asked if he was sending mixed messages, he said, well, yes, I know. Finally, Al-Qaeda has established a new branch in India. Intelligence officials say the terror group is trying to hurt us by trying to cut off our tech support. Let it sink in, let it sink in. So we are now officially and simultaneously illegally at war in Iraq and soon Syria. President Obama declared himself exalted mystic ruler of the universe and exalted mystic ruler of the U.S. Armed Forces. He said this, quote, "While I believe I have the authority to carry out this military action without congressional authorization, I know that the country will be stronger if we take this course, and our actions will even be more effective." Effective? Who is this guy kidding? The NFL's policy against domestic violence is more effective. The specific authorization that was actually granted to the president yesterday in the Senate, Wednesday in the House, actually, if you read the bill, and I read it, it's only 21 pages long, and it's big, giant type like this. Won't take you very long to read it. If you go all the way to the last two, the penultimate paragraph and the ultimate paragraph, the last two, you'll find everything you need to know about what military action was authorized. None. The bill actually explicitly says that there can be no military action without a congressional approval, which Senator Inhofe and others did try and actually present a congressional authorization to use force in Syria and in Iraq if needed against ISIS. And they were going to go forward with the vote, but they don't need to, because no one in Congress is going to stop the madmen that we have as presidents if they want to wage wars anywhere on earth. And in the ice world of Hoth, and to Romulus and back, go through the Stargates, power extends forever. There's no end to it. As a matter of fact, you might say U.S. foreign policy today is foreign because it covers everything that is foreign. Penguins, snakes, salamanders, terrorists, name it, it's covered. It's almost like the old television commercial. Don't worry about it, it's covered. So we have a major problem on our hand, ladies and gentlemen. It's a catastrophe. We need to do something about it. So let's start and talk a little bit about letters of marque and reprisal. So at first Obama said they would just bomb ISIS back to Mecca, right? Over Syria's objections. The Syrians object to this. When I came on stage here, I checked right before I came in to see if the Syrians were still objecting, and they are. The president has now moderated what he said to say that they're trying to negotiate. Now, I want you to think about this. They're trying to negotiate a deal with the Syrians to gain permission to conduct war actions in Syria. Think about that for just a minute. The Obama administration is concerned more with obtaining the Syrian regime's permission to wage a war than they are the United States regime. What is wrong with it? What is going on here? I thought we had conservatives that were elected to run the House of Representatives. And that's what they're running it like, the House of Representatives from the movie Idiocracy. The only thing missing is the flare lights and the disco balls. So I have a question for you. How did we get into this? How did we get to never-ending, full-scale war that has basically been in effect since Korea? Well, I'll back it up and say since 1991, the year of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, 1991, how do we get there from a constitution system that was drafted specifically to try and prevent this insanity from happening? How did this happen? Why does no one in Congress, save for Ron Paul, even propose, or Rand Paul, maybe as a joke, to use these things I talked to you about earlier, letters of marque and reprisal, and then proceed to full-scale war after Congress has declared it, and after, please be very mindful of this as libertarians and conservatives, don't just run around and tell your friends that you want a declaration of war, because these lunatics, these maniacs will declare war. We want you to prove, make your case that it's a just war. We want a just war, and then we want you to declare it. We'll authorize you to go fight it, then you come home. Meanwhile, we don't have, thank you. So how do we get from there, 1787 to here? The short answer is one word: fame. I know it sounds kind of strange. Let me explain. Francis Bacon, the English author, described what he called a term he coined. It's a Latin phrase. It's counter-terrorism imperiorum. It basically means founders of commonwealths, founders of countries. That's what Bacon said most men of power were after: fame. Here's something to consider. Name the famous leaders that you have jogging around in your head pre-George Washington. What do you know most of them for? Doing what? Waging war. Julius Caesar, a great example. Think of the famous men of history. They're famous because they waged war. Bacon put it like this about those men: neither, quote, neither can they be secret and therefore not effectual, but according to the French proverb, beaucoup de brut, peu de fruit. Much fruit, much brute, little fruit. Very strong, small returns. Caesar gets his fame, though. The true marshaling of the degrees of sovereign honor are these. In the first place are counter-terrorism imperiorum, founders of states and commonwealths, such as were Romulus, Sirius, Caesar, Ottoman. How many of you knew that Ottoman Empire was named after a man? Ottoman and Ismail. Plain and simple, folks. It is fame that drove the founders to write the Constitution, and it is fame that drives presidents to grab more power than they were ever granted. You might wonder if the founders knew of this vanity and tried to guard against it. As a matter of fact, they did. James Madison, shortly after, little Jimmy Madison, about that tall, for you on this side, about that tall. Little Jimmy Madison, shortly after the Constitution went into effect in 1789, got into an argument with some guy named Alexander Hamilton. It's a very famous debate. It's Pacificus versus Helvetius. Madison played Helvetius. They like to write in pen names for some reason, as if no one knew who the author was, right? Madison wrote this in Helvidius number 4, quote, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confines the question of war and peace to the legislature, and not to the executive department. Beside the objection to such a mixture to heterogeneous powers, the trust and the temptation would be too great for any one man, such as nature may offer as the prodigy of many centuries, but such as may be expected in the ordinary successions of magistracy. War is in fact the true nurse of executive aggrandizement." Oh, how right he was. Continuing, "In war, a physical force is to be created, and it is the executive will which is to direct it." So we're talking about fame here. So let's think about the rewards of war, and that's what he's writing about. "In war, the public treasuries are to be unlocked, and it is the executive hand which is to dispose them. In war, the honors and emoluments of office are to be multiplied, and it is the executive patronage under which they are to be enjoyed. It is in war, finally, that laurels are to be gathered, and it is the executive brow they are to encircle. The strongest passions and most dangerous weaknesses of the human breast, ambition, avarice, vanity, the honorable or venial love of fame, are all in conspiracy against the desire and duty of peace." Close quote. Well, Jimmy Madison wasn't finished. Writing to Thomas Jefferson 8 years later in 1798, he wrote, quote, "The Constitution supposes," by the way, this is a quote our favorite senator likes to use often. Perhaps you've heard of him. His name's Rand. Last name Paul. Senator Paul uses this quote often appropriately. Some people abuse it, but he uses it correctly. Quote, "The Constitution supposes what history demonstrates, that the executive is the branch most prone to war and most interested in it. Therefore, the Constitution has with studied care, vested that power in the legislature. In the Convention of Delegates in 1787, when they were drafting the Constitution, who were they staring at the entire time they were debating? Washington. 6'4", couldn't miss him in the room, sitting at the head table. So who were they thinking about when they drafted the executive clause? They were thinking about George Washington. They trusted him. He had denied power twice. He had turned his sword over after the end of the Revolutionary War and said, you know, you guys go have fun with your little Congress. I'm going to grow some tobacco. Right down the road here on the banks of the Potomac River, Washington went into retirement. Of course, they dragged him out to go to this convention. So the delegates of the Federal Convention were staring at who they thought was going to be the first president, and they were correct. And they were also staring at what they thought the model would be of the first president. Now, including personality-wise. Well, they could not possibly have known that a really insane madman named Abraham Lincoln would follow Washington sometime later and preside over the death of 800,000 Americans of both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, an absolute tragedy in human terms. That's what the quest for fame gets you. What is Lincoln most famous for? Preserving the Union. Through what? Civil War. War. So the point is that we're making here is that when they drafted the Constitution, they gave us some tools to guard against fame, men pursuing fame. So if you divide the power up, they can't all be famous. They can lust after it, but they're going to have to get agreement. And so they divided the power up, and they gave us a couple of ways to deal with madmen that are terrorists, a couple of ways to deal with madmen that are communists, a couple of ways to deal with madmen that are Nazis, whatever the case may be. Letters of marque and reprisal. Delegate Pierce Butler at the convention, if you're not convinced about this, said this about Washington. He was a delegate, voted affirmative, signed the Constitution, was elected to the first Congress afterwards. Quote, "Yet after all, my dear sir, I am free to acknowledge that his powers are full great," talking about the president, and greater than I was disposed to make them. Nor do I believe they would have been so great had not so many of the members cast their eyes towards General Washington as president and shaped their ideas of the powers to be given the president by their opinions of his virtue so that the man who by his patriotism and virtue contributed largely to the emancipation of his country may be the innocent means of its being when he is laid low and oppressed, meaning when he dies. Butler also made a point about war powers and distinguishing between the English king and the American president. Quote, he, King George, has the sole right of declaring war or making peace, so that the lives of thousands of his subjects are at his will. Let's also be clear about something. So one other thing, so we know where the power is vested to issue letters of marque and reprisal, to issue any kind of a bounty, to make any kind of a declaration of war, or to conduct any warlike activities whatsoever. And I'm going to get to that in just a moment here. The President of the United States cannot veto an act of congressional declaration of war. There is the one act that Congress can pass, the President has no say-so over, that and a constitutional amendment. Remember that. If he has the power, another Madison quote here, if he has the power to make something, then he has the power to unmake something. You can't grant the power to manage a welfare state and not then grant the power to end the welfare state. The two go hand in hand. He is not granted the power to be a king with his toy army. No offense to any military guys, I don't mean your toys. He treats you as if you're a bunch of pieces on a Stratigo board. Thank you. So it's clear that the founders put a tremendous amount of thought into war powers. In 1997, Georgetown Constitution professor William Michael Traynor sought to prove, what I just told you basically, that the president's war-making powers did not exist outside of executing war after Congress had initiated it in any way, shape, or form. End of story. So how can Congress make war? Well, there are two ways. One is granting letters of marque and reprisal. And since our Congress cannot be bothered with the toil of waging wars and preventing presidents from waging theirs, the letters are rarely used, as we explained earlier. The last time a letter of marque and reprisal was used was in 1941, and it was issued to the Goodyear blimp Resolute. How many of you knew that? The blimp was operated as an anti-submarine privateer based out of Los Angeles. As the only U.S. craft to operate under a letter of marque since the War of 1812, the Resolute, armed with a rifle and flown by its civilian crew, patrolled the seas on the West Coast for Nazi submarines. Letter of marque. It happened in 1941. So what is this letter of marque and reprisal? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the first recorded use of letters of marque and reprisal was in an English statute in the year of our Lord, 1354, during the reign of Edward III. The phrase referred to, quote, a license granted by a sovereign to a subject authorizing him, of course this is 2014, I have to say her, and then I have to throw the T in there, and there's all sorts of acronyms. In any event, authorizing them, we'll just make it plural, to make reprisals on the subjects of a hostile state for injuries alleged to have been done to him by the enemy's army. The founders gave Congress the power to grant these letters of marque and reprisal in Article 1, Section 8. They are also using, quote, language peculiar to international law, and again, that language had a precise and limited meaning. Sovereigns granted letters of marque and reprisal to individuals, allowing them to pursue specific claims against citizens of other countries. They could grant a letter to any of you today. You could have a letter granted to you to go hunt down John Lennon the beheader, or whatever they're calling the guy from Hydra, ISIS. Sovereigns granted letters of marque and reprisal to individuals, allowing them to pursue specific claims against citizens of other countries. These people were thereby authorized to take the property and sometimes even seize the person of their debtors and those who had wronged them. In wartime, the letters empowered civilians to capture the property of the enemy and her citizens. But the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal was not the power to start a war. We don't want war, right? But we have to have defense. This is one way to get that defense before going to a war. Professor Charles Lofgren, another gentleman that studied this question, for example, said this: the word declare, as used in the Constitution, as defined by Samuel Johnson's dictionary of 1757, had a broader meaning than it did in the treatises and international practice. It meant commence. Congress can declare, they can commence war. So a president, he executes it. He doesn't commence it. He doesn't start it. Similarly, the phrase letters of marque and reprisal conferred on Congress power over general reprisals outside the context of declared war. Most important, remember this when you're chatting this up with your friends. The two phrases, they follow one another in the Constitution. They're meant to be read together. You don't just read the Congress shall have the power to declare war. You keep reading and issue letters of marque and reprisal and establish punishments for felonies and piracies committed on the high seas and make all rules on land and sea for the capture. That's all one clause. It's separated by paragraphs, and we think it's 8 different clauses. It's one. It grants to Congress every power that is conceivable that the military can execute. Every one of them. Back to letters of marque and reprisal and privateers. We've all heard the arguments with your neocon friends. I call them Decepticons. Many of them are my colleagues that work moonlight with this thing called the Talk Radio Justice League. You've all heard their stories and their fatuous claims and the feuds that they've gotten into with myself, with Professor Thomas Woods, I think you know Tom Woods, Professor Dr. Kevin Gutzman, over the question of whether or not President Jefferson ever abused this power. And of course, they all claim, certain individuals who you know by name, that he did, and that President Jefferson did not seek Congress's authority to wage war against the Barbary pirates. That is just an outright lie, and you are totally ignorant of history. Furthermore, you're illiterate as well. You can't read, because this isn't even difficult to find. I'd like to read you from the page of the Congressional record on December the 3rd, 1801, in the year of our Lord, 1801. I got to put my glasses on. This text is really small. This, ladies and gentlemen, comes from the Library of Congress. That is a photocopy of a page generated for, that's the transcript of the debate that went on that day in Congress, okay? This is a legitimate document. You can find it on my website. I didn't Photoshop it. I want to read to you what it says about the question of the Barbary pirates in context. Quote, the House resolved itself into a committee of the whole on the State of the Union, the following resolution being under consideration. Quote, resolved that it is expedient that the President be authorized by law further and more effectually to protect the commerce of the United States against the Barbary powers, close quote. Back to the transcript. Mr. Nicholson, a member of the House of Representatives, before they were the House of Representing and were a really cool band. Mr. Nicholson said that when this resolution was laid yesterday on the table, he had moved for reasons that he had assigned to strike out the words further and more. He was, on reflection, more and more persuaded of the accuracy of his objections to the unqualified term of the original motion. If we adopt it, we pledge ourselves to increase the naval force at present at the disposition of the president. Now, what did he just say? He just said he's authorizing the president, Jefferson, disposition means go to your disposition to do this. He's authorizing the president to go sick the Navy and privateers, which, by the way, I'm a New Orleanian and we have a school, University of New Orleans, that's our mascot, the privateers. to authorize privateers to do exactly what a letter of marque and reprisal says you should do. And they did. But it was the Marines that got the job done. Continuing on, Mr. Giles opposed the striking out the words which, in his opinion, did not relate to the quantum of force placed under executive disposition. There's that confounded term again. It's a great term, actually. But to the measures proposed to be taken by the executive. Now, again, what did he just say? To the measures proposed to be taken by the executive. Hydra is the 2014 equivalent of a Barbary pirate. They are identical. It is fallacy to even run around and say, we've never seen violence like this before. You've never seen Muslim snuff videos before? They've been around for 25, 30 years. This is documented. These poor souls that were lost, beloved James Foley and Mr. Sotloff, they weren't the first to be beheaded by Muslim madmen. This has been going on for a long time. For all we know, the Barbary pirates, who were impressing American sailors on the high seas off the coast of North Africa and did kill some of them. It's not documented how they killed them, but they killed them. So there's no material difference. Why didn't Jefferson then just unilaterally decide to go sick the Navy, a global force for good, on the Barbary pirates? Why didn't he? Because he didn't have the authority, and he knew he didn't have the authority. And every step of the way, President Jefferson went back to Congress and asked for expanded power. Every time the situation changed, as he gathered intelligence, he went back to Congress and he asked for his declaration to be altered. One more example, and then I'll close, and we can talk about it if Matt will give me some time. President James K. Polk. How many of you are here from the great state of Texas? How many Texas natives? We got one? Oh, great. President Polk, when he waged war against the Mexicans to take the territory, of course, we were aiding and abetting what was then the Texas Republic. Maybe that day will come again soon. So, he was aiding and abetting what was then the Texas Republic. He encountered Santa Anna and the Santa Ana hordes defending Mexico and defending the western part of Texas and also defending parts of New Mexico and what is today the Chihuahua state in Mexico. And he realized, the general, Zachary Taylor, who became a president, Taylor realized that what authority he had been granted had ended at a certain geographical point, and against it was solely and explicitly directed against a certain part of the Mexican army. It wasn't addressed to this part of the army. So what did he do? Well, he could have called Dick Cheney up and called in a sortie bombing, right? He went to Congress. The president went and appeared. Polk went to Congress, gave a speech and delivered it in 1843 and told Congress, my intelligence has changed. The situation has been altered. I need you to reauthorize, and I need you to authorize this mission. So our historical record is very clear, ladies and gentlemen. There is no constitutional authority for the President of the United States to wage any military action without our duly elected Congress. End of story. Anyone that tells you any differently has not studied history, either that again or they are illiterate. Wait a minute. Maybe I'm talking about members of Congress. What I just told you totally eviscerates the Warhawks version of Jefferson and the Barbary Pirates, doesn't it? Totally eviscerates any case that can be made with these loudmouths on television and radio and in print running around saying, well, I think the president has the authority to do this. The president doesn't even have the authority to send an aircraft carrier. He can't even direct the aircraft carrier without Congress first authorizing the carrier to be built and the carrier to go on a mission, which may be to protect commerce on the high seas. That's fine. But you have to direct it. That's why we have a legislature. Now, while I don't think that Congress is ever going to begin issuing letters of marque and reprisal again and calling them that, I do think, or whatever the 20th century equivalent may be, I do think that we can at least begin winning converts over to our way of thinking. So that even if intervention is warranted, even if, that there are more effective and productive ways to accomplish it. The bonus part is that all of those ways can all be called constitutional. Thank you.